Welcome back to the Anchored Podcast. Folks, I'm here today with a man who needs no introduction for many of you. Davies Owens has been part of the classical Christian renewal movement for a long time and is the voice of BaseCamp Live, which I believe is probably the most downloaded and listened to podcast in the classical Christian education arena. Davies, thanks so much for being with us.
Jeremy, thanks for letting me have the opportunity. It's so good to be with you, and I love what you guys are doing. So this is exciting to have this conversation.
Well, and you should have been one of our very first guests. You've been part of this movement for such a long time. And I think your voice, everybody knows your voice, everybody trusts your voice because so many folks listen to BaseCamp Live. We're doing something fun right now is that you're not the host for once and are being interviewed. I think a lot of folks who enjoy listening to you would love to just kind of hear a little bit about kind of the early days of Davies Owens. What was school like for you growing up? I mean, did you get a nice,
Man,
rich, classical Christian education?
oh, don't we wish? I mean, so often I'm in rooms with parents, and raise your hand. How many of you had class? It's starting to happen, but no, I'm part of the generation that unfortunately did not have that, and honestly envied my own children who had all three of my kids who are now graduates of the K-12 journey. My wife and I have been married 32 years. So I always say, Jeremy, I now, I used to stand up in front of parent open house events and speak of the wonders of classical education, knowing the whole time my oldest was like in third grade. And I can now officially say, no, we've gone through it. It's been fantastic. And if anything, I just get jealous of what my kids had the experience of. God does have a sense of humor. I mean, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, kind of a school mutt, if you want to call it that. I mean, I was in Atlanta public schools back in the day, and then ended up in two different quote Christian private college prep schools. Ended up graduating from Woodward Academy, which is I think the largest K-12 college prep school in the nation these days. And just school for me wasn't my first love. I was probably seeing school just like most people is reading, writing, arithmetic, and check the box and get the grade and go to the next thing. And in God's sort of sense of humor, again, I ended up becoming very much passionate about this classical Christian experience. Kind of I went into the local church world, loved the church. I was in the church for about 12 years, suburban, urban. And the whole time I kept thinking, how do we influence next generation when we only have a few hours a week in the building? And I'd run youth ministries and young adult programs, and even did my doctoral research on using internet-based technology to build online community. I worked for Christianity.com because I thought maybe if we could leverage this thing called the internet when it was really starting to pick up momentum 20 years ago in terms of connecting people, maybe this is a way we could extend the reach of building up families and sharing the gospel and educating. And in the meanwhile, my oldest was a little, 5-year-old, and we started thinking about schools in Atlanta. And I had a flashback to an experience I'd had when I was 18. Long story short, my mom had gone through an agnostic period in the 70s and had read Francis Schaeffer's books, and decided that she was going to kind of make a pilgrimage to L'Abri Fellowship in Switzerland. And I had the joy of going with her as a young teenager, and then went back when I was 18. And I tell you the story to say I was there in this beautiful setting, and I'm watching these young children of Susan Schaeffer, Macaulay Schaeffer's daughter, who are winsome, articulate, putting on Shakespeare plays for fun. And I remember saying to Susan, I'm 18, I don't have kids, but if I ever have kids, I want to do what you're doing. I said, what are you doing? She said, well, it's this thing called classical education. And it's, Charlotte Mason was part of it as well, who I think is also classical. And filed that away. So fast forward to, I've got a 5-year-old in Atlanta, and I got involved in a brand new classical Christian school there in Midtown Atlanta, and got on the board, and then got so excited about it, I became the interim and then full-time head of school. And I realized, all right, I'm getting it now. If we want to change our culture, we want to restore family, we might want to start with these young children and raise them up over the 16,000 hours. So that was 23 years ago, Jeremy. So I've never looked back.
Okay, so you were at L'Abri when you were 18. Like, did you hang out with Francis Schaeffer?
I didn't hang out with him. I did meet him at one point. I was hanging out with a lot of the people that had been there early on with him. I minored in philosophy, so I actually interviewed a lot of the early workers and did some research on the life of Francis Schaeffer. And I was mentored. Parents had divorced when I was young, mentored by a gentleman named Donald Drew, who was Cambridge grad. And I remember, Jeremy, when I was there at 18, and I was a typical American teen, you know, I kind of education light, just the experience I'd had. And he was putting books, Donald Drew, who's a worker at L'Abri, who was also the mentor of Oz Guinness. So Oz and I have kind of this interesting connection through our shared kind of father figure mentor, Donald Drew. But Donald, I remember putting books like Martin Lloyd-Jones's The Christian Soldier book in front of me. And I'm like, gosh, this is thick, it wasn't even that hard, but it just where I was at that point. And he said, stay the course. And then he would have high teas on Sunday afternoons and play classical music and read different great works. And I thought I was awakened to something I'd never seen. So that's an important part of this story. I think in a sense, I got a taste of classical and what's possible even at that early age, which set, again, this trajectory for where I am now that I believe so much in what we're doing with classical education and raising the next generation.
Man, Davies, I love that story. I was working at Annapolis EP Church and met students that were going to Rockbridge Academy, and they were just different. I love that you
Yeah.
saw that I want to raise kids like that, and you heard about this thing, and as you said, kind of filed it away. So then you go back into pastoral ministry. And did you come across a school that also had, a church that also had a school attached to it?
I definitely saw, that was absolutely a common model. And some were more, I guess, in the classical vein. A lot of them were just using the building space to be good stewards of it and bring Christian schools in, which I think is a really important and increasingly viable way for classical schools to partner up with churches in that regard. But I think it was probably more the early experience I'd had at L'Abri that kind of gave me an awakening of what classical is, and then again ended up at Heritage Preparatory School in Atlanta. And I often say, Jeremy, I was probably about 2 or 3 years into it, even as a head of school. I remember talking with Chris Perrin about what exactly is classical Christian education. And he was saying, Davies, it's human soul formation. And I thought,
Wow.
Okay, I need to take this a couple steps further in, because I think, part of what has been in the last 15, 20 years for me, a real passion is how do we explain what is classical education and what is classical Christian education? I have a kind of a funny video I did a number of years ago at the ACCS conference where we walked around with a film crew and I just said, hey, what's classical Christian education? And it's, there were some good answers, but there was a lot of folks that were caught off guard and fumbled a bit. And I thought, wow, can you imagine being at any other industry's conference and ask them, what is, whatever it may be, and not have a real good. So I have really tried to make it part of my interest and passion, maybe not having come through a classical education, but being aware of some of the challenges of how do we understand what this is in our modern moment, and how do we articulate it in a way that what I've done over the last 7 years with BaseCamp is really try to articulate kind of at the 101 level, what is classical Christian education to minivan Mary and soccer dad Sam, who put their kid in a classical school and love the uniforms and character development, but they're not quite sure why we're doing Latin instead of Spanish, or they're not really sure why we're spending so much time reading about these, old pagan, Greeks and Romans. Why does this make sense for a modern world? And are we just a throwback education, or are we actually really preparing the best education for a complicated world, which I believe we are? And so I've really increasingly desired to, kind of take on that challenge of how do we recontextualize, articulate classical education in a way that is compelling and beautiful to a modern parent and educator. So,
Davies, let's talk about BaseCamp Live. I don't know the number, but everybody in the classical Christian world, has heard it at least a few times. I know a lot of folks I know they don't ever miss an episode. I don't know how long you've been doing this. When I think back of my early days, kind of in the movement, going to STL and ACCS, you would be there, interviewing people. And in many ways, you've become, kind of a really important voice that people just know and trust within this movement. How did this idea come about, and why BaseCamp? What's with the name?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeremy. Well, the name BaseCamp, and I remember people saying to me, "Oh, this is gonna be challenging. People are gonna think you're selling like REI climbing gear." And I said, "Well, people used to think Amazon was a river," and so I think my desire was to create really, it's an analogy. And I think we all can appreciate the challenges of raising the next generation, whether you're a parent or an educator. And so I said, look, it's a bit like climbing up the side of Mount Everest here, raising the next generation over the 16,000 hours. And along the way, of course, mountain climbers do these things called base camps, where they stop and they eat and they get warm and they recharge and get re-inspired to keep climbing. And I thought, we need that. We need that as educators. We need that as parents. It's a long journey, and there's not a lot of reinforcement and re-encouragement along the way. So that was the analogy. And I think, hopefully now people don't think of climbing gear immediately when they think of BaseCamp. We do have a really significant number of followers. And it was really, Jeremy, just born out of, I always say, I was a desperate school administrator trying to figure out how do you communicate with modern parents. And I often say, and I say this lovingly as a school administrator, we use kind of 1998 delivery systems to communicate over a 13-year journey where we're raising the next generation. How do we actually come together and encourage and have that alignment? So what we typically do 1998 style is we send out emails, or we have, with newsletters with lots of words in them, or we do events at the school. All of those things are good to do. But I think the modern frame of the millennial Gen Z family, they're on the go, and it's hard to get more than that Pareto 20% down to the school building. So 7 years ago, I began, David Goodwood and I, in fact, in the Ambrose Library out here in Boise at the Ambrose School, started this. We said, well, let's just call it BaseCamp for the reasons I just gave you, and then let's have the event at the school library. And then we ran into my 1998 problem, where we were getting the 20% that were true believers that knew most of the answers, and the ones we really wanted to reach weren't coming down. So this thing called podcasting 7 years ago, when we started, was starting to pick up momentum. One of my favorite stories, I was at a school conference, national conference, and I had a teacher come up to me with completely all serious question. She said, "Is this about gardening?" And I went, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, it's throwing out pods, like podcasting." I went, "Oh boy, we're..." So needless to say, 7 years later, podcasting has continued to build momentum. And I'm doing a lot of not only work, I think, trying to help with better, more accessible content, but I do believe that we as schools need to think about better delivery systems. So I'm actually piloting this week with 24 schools a brand new initiative that's basically a short form drive time podcast. So Monday morning, every family gets it. It's customized their school. It's a mix of local content and nationally syndicated content, parenting tips, classical 101 information. So I just think we've got to think a little bit more dynamically if we're going to partner well with our families, that we so urgently have to have as part of the classical formula. As you know, we're not into the outsourced education. It's a in loco parentis, lock arms, let's do this together. So that's the journey. Yeah. And it continues to go.
Yeah. Davies, when I think back about our conversations over the past 7 or 8 years, I think a number of times I was like, it'd be so cool if you just went all in with BaseCamp and like made this into just, something that like is bringing folks into the movement. Cause there's a lot of folks that are kind of periphery, right? You see this on the Catholic side and on the Protestant side where, more and more, ACSI kind of ceases schools. You go and you tour. I was just at Little Rock Christian, like it's pretty classical. Who is the audience for this? I mean, I keep thinking a lot of folks you're articulating with a lot of clarity, I think, what so many folks are kind of looking for in the dark, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, the audience, as I indicated earlier, I mean, I actually think about this all the time, and it's important anytime you do marketing, like who's the actual, you might call it an avatar, or the actual image of the person you're speaking to. And it's minivan Mary and soccer dad Sam. And increasingly 50% of BaseCamp Plus are, I haven't worked out their names yet, maybe Alvin, the administrator, and, and Tom, the teacher, or something. But, it's us, it's me, it's you, it's parents. I am increasingly concerned that, Jeremy, as I talk to school heads, if I put 30 heads in a room, or key, administrators, teachers, and ask the question, what keeps you up at night? As much as the answer is probably going to be a range of things, from, board governance challenges, since 80%, according to ISM, of heads leave because of tension with their boards, or because of financial concerns, or building and
Yeah.
grounds or HR, all that. But I think the issue that's kind of the elephant in the room is that what I'm hearing is these families are not the same as they were 3-4 years ago. The students are not the same. They're showing up more distracted, less aware of classical education, maybe even less concerned, more frazzled, more hoping the school's going to just basically pick up the slack for what they can't do at home. I'm making a broad generalization. There's many families that show up very, very focused and committed and aware of the richness of the education. But again, I think if we were talking about classical education as a business, I think we need to probably pay more attention than we have historically and who our customers are. I had an experience a couple of years ago that was very formative for me. The head of our board of our classical school in Atlanta at the time was one of the senior leaders at Chick-fil-A. So it was always fun to kind of get to look over his shoulder into the Chick-fil-A organization. And I had an experience several years ago where he invited me in to kind of watch them think about what the changing landscape looks like for them as a business. So they brought in kind of their key leadership team, they brought in a marketing team, and they said, today is called BTR, Beyond the Restaurant. And the idea was that they said, look, the generation of millennial Gen Zers that are coming into to buy our chicken are changing in how they expect the relationship with
Mm.
this restaurant to work. They don't want to come in and sit in the dining hall. In fact, at the time, they said there are 279 delivery services like Uber Eats. Their engagement with the restaurant was changing. And I thought, wow, we need to do a BTS, Beyond the School. What does it look like to continue to do classical education with excellence with a very different millennial Gen Z,
Mm.
what's the frame of this family of families coming in? And, when I was just last week at Seattle Classical Christian School with Matt Greco, the head of school, and I laughed, Jeremy, because here I am. It's easy for me to say we all need to. Hey, schools, you need to, in the midst of everything you're doing, you need to now think about how do you partner even more intentionally. How do you educate parents on parenting best practices and on understanding classical? And there's Matt. While we're trying to meet, the boiler in their 100-year-old beautiful building in downtown Seattle goes out, and so Matt spends the better part of his day trying to work with plumbers, and eventually had to have somebody sit down there with a 5-gallon bucket and fill up this boiler with water. And I think, welcome to running a classical school. It's a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
And so here, when I'm saying we need to think about beyond the school, how do we partner better? How do we articulate what is classical better? How do we help families get a hold of managing Cyclops, the one-eyed screen monster that is now, as I call on the BaseCamp podcast, the 301 problem? We can control kind of the school day and the environment and the limitations of technology, but we better be figuring out how to help parents sort through all of this, because that 5 to 11 hour, depending on what survey you read, techno-influence is undermining and rewiring attention spans and reframing the loves that we've formed through reading the great books and the great ideas. So we've got some real challenges that we haven't maybe seen even in the last 3 to 5 years. I think we're in a different world today. And so I really have a passion to try to help schools, equip them with the content they need to be able to help onboard and align the culture of our families and of our staff, for that matter. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we're in this together.
Dave, I want to talk a little more about this and don't want to go too far down kind of a rabbit hole here, but you're saying the students are different, the families are different than they were 30 or 40 years ago. We're just a week out or so from the first Neuralink that was installed in someone's brain. Thank you, Elon Musk. We're rapidly, and we're hitting the gas, accelerating into this very strange new world. Um, how different are students right now? Are they just a little more distracted, or is it more sinister?
Again, it depends. It depends obviously on the individual family. I think what's happening is you're getting some percentage of families that are really stepping up and saying, okay, this is really this being the techno intrusions, the screens are really undermining our home life. And so I'm encouraged in that I am seeing a lot of families and now schools sort of really collaborating as a community and saying, let's don't just keep saying how bad smartphones are. I call it the Nancy Reagan problem of you just say no to drugs, but what am I saying yes to? So I see parents coming together, see schools coming together saying, let's start addressing this earlier. Let's create pledges and commitments to not be on technology moving forward. Having said that, Jeremy, I think that's definitely more the exception than the rule. I think part of the problem, saw a statistic recently that Gen X is only 7% less on the screen than Gen Z. So it's very easy for us as parents to complain about all of this. The reality is that we are, if you will, as addicted as adults, as students are to the technology. And again, there's so much research on this. I mean, when you realize that there are 95 million photos and videos posted on Instagram every day, 500 hours of video uploaded to YouTube, and you realize that 70% of teenagers are on YouTube as subscribers, and they say that social media creators get 12 times the number of comments than traditional celebrities do, which is even more than any other hero that we're putting forth in classical education. There's such a counter narrative that's building momentum. It's very loud, and it's dopamine hits on addictive technology for at least 30%, they say, are at that clinical level of addiction. And the problem is, again, this is to your point, it is a very deep hole to jump into, but I think it's a conversation we have to have, both in terms of, okay, let's soberly talk about the impact of that. I know of a Christian prep school in Atlanta. It was just in Atlanta recently, and the challenge is the school basically said, we give up. We're so tired of the pressure from the parents to keep the kids off their phones. We just gave up. And so now all the kids have access to smartphones all day long, which is, unfathomable to me. But the pressure that administrators are feeling from the parents to have access to their children, claiming safety or whatever it may be, I think we've got to really formulate strong answers for what this needs to look like, starting with the kindergartner family and giving a path forward. Because otherwise, I think we're going to be seeing single-digit success here in terms of kids that go the distance.
Yeah.
It's
Has this movement that you've been in, and you've really helped to build and create, over the years, over decades, has it hit this Malcolm Gladwell tipping point? Has classical education kind of arrived on the main stage right now? What are your thoughts?
I do think we are seeing some wonderful acceleration. I remember 10, 15 years ago, you would know this, talking to college admission officers, that it's kind of like homeschool 20 years ago. It was like, wait, what are you guys doing? And now they're offering scholarships to these kids, that they get that they're showing up with strong work ethics. They're critical thinkers. All the things that we claim, we're actually seeing the fruit of it, as are other people. I know a patent attorney here in Boise that says, I will never hire anything but classical trained students, because they're so significantly different in terms of just their demeanor and their capacities. And so I think we're now quickly gaining awareness. I think the average Christian family is increasingly aware of classical as a option out there, and they're coming, especially since COVID, looking. So this is a good thing. It also means we have to be a little bit more intentional in how we interview and screen families to make sure they really understand what this is. And it's not just, we've created Mayberry over here in the corner to keep your kids safe. We do kind of want Mayberry in grammar school, but at some point we actually need Opie to head to the big city and be ready. And I think that's a big part of what I like to talk about, is this is a forward facing, real world ready education. We are not just the throwback, fusty, sentimental group over here in the corner. So, but no, I think we're on the rise.
Yeah. Davies, your BaseCamp has become, for a lot of schools that I know of, kind of the podcast that a lot of heads of school are recommending for parents. And, when I think about the schools that I have visited that are really, really flourishing, really on fire, places like the Veritas School in Richmond, Founders Classical, Leander, Texas, Our Lady of Lourdes, in Denver. You have that. One of the constants is you have incredible buy-in from the parents, from the community. It's hard to nurture that, and in some ways you're helping out every head of school that is wanting to create this missional buy-in. So if folks start listening, where do they pick up? Do they just go and listen to the latest episode, or is there somewhere they started episode 1 back in 2015? How do they get started?
Well, I have had some people say they've been binge listening. I'm like, boy, that's that's impressive if that's what you're doing. We're close to 300 episodes, Jeremy, and there is you go to the main website and type in the search bar, and just something you may be interested in. Likelihood is something will come up. Ranging from, I always talk about, there's kind of 3 areas we try to build content around. One is parenting 101, folks like Keith McCurdy coming in, just really helping us think about what does it look like to raise kids today. As I've been doing focus groups around the country with young families, I had one mom say to me recently, there is no James Dobson anymore. There's no singular voice to help us figure out how to parent. And it's, quote, a smorgasbord of competing information on what it even means to parent. So I'm realizing that part of what we're seeing a lot of, the higher download rates are sometimes just around basic things like if somebody goes to the site right now and looks, types in Keith McCurdy, he's in there at least once a month. We just did one on baselining, which is this idea that he says 98% of young people today that are drug into counseling offices and taken to doctors to be put on medication because of perceived ADD or ADHD or whatever. He says 98% of that can be cleared within 90 days just by getting them off of technology, getting these kids to sleep and eat well, and just basic stuff. So, I feel like there's a need. You really have to just back up. So we can't educate if we don't have home life and parenting figured out. So that's a third of, or, probably half of what these episodes are about. The other third is probably what is classical. Like I indicated, just let's talk about the great books. Let's talk about why we educate, some of the idiosyncrasies and curiosities of the modern parent looking in on us. Like, why are you doing that? And why would you wear uniforms? That just stifles their creativity and their individualism. I'm like, well, there's an answer to all that. So we try to answer those basic questions. And then the other component is really what's happening in the culture. Let's interview Barna. Let's talk about sort of these changes and trends that are happening generationally, and be able to be wise to that as parents and as educators. So that's you're going to get probably a mix from one episode to the next of that. But no, thank you for your encouragement, Jeremy. I think this is I'm kind of headed towards what I'm calling BaseCamp 2.0. We want to move to video. We're going to get an even better indexing system. But I'd love to hear from anybody listening that, reach out to me, info@BaseCamp Live, directly email me. You can also jump on and start listening. It's definitely would be a joy to have more listeners.
Davies, we always conclude the Anchor podcast talking about books. Is there one of the books, or maybe one or two, that have been most formative for you?
Well, most formative ever, there's so many things I would point to. I mean, Schaefer early on was definitely early influence for me. I think, God Who Is There, Escape from Reason. I mean, those books to me early in my journey were helpful to realize, like, wow, evangelical Christians can actually engage in thoughtful conversation. This was not the world I grew up in, where it was just love Jesus and it'll all work out. And it will all work out when you love Jesus. But what if we could actually think deeply, and where does philosophy fit in that? And that shaped me into a lot of the directions of where I am with classical education today. To the topic we've been discussing, I've just finished going back through 2 books. One is Todd Oppenheimer's book, The Flickering Mind, which I recommend to everyone. And Oppenheimer really, counters this notion that education is better on technology, and sort of demystifies a lot of the things that were happening in the 80s and 90s, when a lot of, Microsoft and Apple execs were convincing, the Department of Education that we need to all instill iPads, before iPads were just computers, around all these kids so that they'll be ready for the future world. Sounds great, but it's actually counter to what the science shows. I would say a similar book would be Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows, which is, again, he'd written an article in Atlantic Monthly a number of years ago called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And, again, to that point, there's a lot of research that I'm trying to become even more aware of, so I can help, fight this fight for our school leaders and for our families, just saying, let's don't fall into that trap of believing that just because we're in a technology oriented world, we have to bury our kids in that. They will be far better off actually learning how to think and write and articulate well, and the technology will follow that.
Again, we're here with Davies Owens, the voice of BaseCamp Live. Folks, you've got to tune in. You've got to subscribe if you have not already. Davies, thanks for being with us, and come back soon.
Thank you, Jeremy, for the opportunity. Look forward to being back with you.